brings us to my introduction of Mr. Daniel Hill, Knight of the Holy Sepulchre, erstwhile convener of chaplaincies for the University of Sydney, and now president of special projects or something like that. Basically, he did such a good job that they gave him more work to do. Dan is recently married and lives in the idyllic coast and commutes up to Sydney. He will be giving a talk that he's prepared and delivered a number of times over the years to various student bodies and other groups on the First Crusade. Now, you may be wondering, why are we talking about the First Crusade at a convention of Dominican laity? The Crusades actually have a particularly interesting connection to our order. I'm not sure into how much detail Dan will go, so I'll try not to pick the
I'm not going to do that.
There you go. Sure. So, the Crusades were preached around the same time as the formation of the order. And something that many people don't realize is that Crusades were not a war of aggression. They were, first of all, a mission to protect those who wanted to go on pilgrimage to the holy places from the aggression of pirates and Muslims, usually the same, but also to preach to those pirates and Muslims along the way. Now that preaching mission was very much part of the living charism of the Dominican and Franciscan mendicant orders. St. Francis himself actually preached to the Sultan. St. Dominic wished to be martyred at the hands of the Saracen. And we have this on the authority of many of the writings from the time. And so nowadays we live in a period of almost a new crusade where we are under attack and we're fighting almost what feels like a losing defensive battle. So it pays for us to be aware of the more military history that underpins the concept. And it may help us in our reflection on our place as lay Dominicans now. So, sorry for not saying much more about you, but Mr. Daniel. This is your first talk for the conference? Yes, it is. Oh, wow. Set the scene. One of the other reasons that generally speaking why it's good to perhaps have an understanding of the Crusades is because it's one of those very controversial topics and occurrences in the history of Christianity and Catholicism. It's often brought up as an example as to how bad and horrible the Catholic Church is and was, and it's good to have a proper sense of what were the Crusades, what's the context, what happened. Now I'm going to be focused on the First Crusade. I can't do the whole lot. And the reason I focus on the First Crusade, one is because that's where most of my expertise lies, so it's much easier for me to do so. But secondly, it's the origins of the movement, and that's always a good place to start. So I'm going to talk about the history of the Crusading movement, the First Crusade, what are the general ideas that lead to it. If we've got time, we could go through perhaps some common myths about the Crusade, but hopefully I'll give a conceptual answer before we get there, so we might need to spend time on that. Okay, next, I've got a little slide marking down the back. Thanks, Robert, you might have heard of him. Next slide, Robert. So, setting the scene for the First Crusade, I'll talk a little bit about the expansion of Islamic control in the Mediterranean. Here we have the Mediterranean, Europe in 450 AD. You can see that there's the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman, you might recall that they were split in two. There was an emperor in each empire. It was considered too big. You've had the experience of the Huns taking a large area of the north, and you have the rise of independent kingdoms within the Mediterranean. They're the Visigoths, if you see the purple. And then the Persian Empire is still very, very strong in the east. And what does happen, of course, is that the Western Roman Empire crumbles due to invasions and migrations of a whole variety of different peoples. The whole Mediterranean is crumbled.
And the Eastern Roman Empire eventually contracts to becomes what's known as the Byzantine Empire. So that's where we start. Next slide. So here we have, shifting forward a couple of hundred years, we've had that fall of the Western Roman Empire. We have the Eastern Roman Empire kind of taking over bits that it had an influence in the Roman Empire, had an influence in. So you see the Eastern Roman Empire now surrounds almost the entirety of the Mediterranean. We have the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. Very important to be aware of them because they're a Christian kingdom. They're not Roman, but and then you have the Frankish kingdom. But you have a little green dot in Medina. Now, what's also going on at this time is an intense battle between the Byzantine Empire and the Persians. Huge and long-standing warfare. You know, some say it's one of the longest wars in history, the Greeks versus the Persians. It's probably true. Going for a few thousand years, really. And that's what's really happening. But in Medina, Muhammad appears. He has his visions. He gains a lot of support in the local tribes. He wages war with some local tribes. And eventually a movement begins completely unseen. Nobody cared about that part of the world. Byzantines technically were kind of in control of it, but they didn't really care less. Next slide, please. Very quickly it expands. So here's 670 AD, and the whole notion of the Red Whirlwind from the desert, which is Heliopolis from memory, it might be Chesterton, one of those two, is quite apt. An enormous expansion, conquering of vast tracts of what was the Byzantine Empire, what was the Roman Empire, all Christian territories, very ancient Christian territories, including Jerusalem itself. You can see it goes right up past Aleppo, they conquer Antioch, and then they're coming all across North Africa. Next slide. Oh, sorry, can we go back one?
Last century.
Yeah. And then you can see that, in fact, what is often forgotten is that Islam goes right into France. In 732, you have the Battle of Tours, which their expansion into Europe is finally stopped.
Is Islam going into like Albigensian territory, south from?
Yes.
So,
yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are some thoughts about that, but I haven't read anything in more detail.
that area is like sort of liable to sort of heresy.
Yeah. Well, there's also
anything except Christianity.
But there's also a claim, double predestination, which you get from John Calvin, comes from Islam via southern France. But I've never, that's what I've heard from academics, I've never read a paper on it, but I mean, that in fact, it can cover the North, it's an Islamic cover influence. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how quick, how expansive this was, this expansion, and I suppose how revolutionary it was. You know, all these areas had been part of the Roman Empire for a long, long time. They had an identity of that type. You had these new kingdoms. You know, we talk about the Gothic invasions or the barbarian invasions. These barbarians weren't trying to be barbarians. They're actually all trying still to be Romans. There's a very strong sense of Christianity and being a part of the kind of the broad sense of what the Roman Empire was in this kingdom. But there's a huge sweep out of Arabia, and you can see also how far east they go as well. They completely conquer Persia, and it's likely that if the Persians and the Greeks, the Byzantines hadn't been fighting so intensely, and Persia had been finally defeated by Heraclius, the emperor of Byzantium, that they would have been a stronger buffer against Islamic invasion. But because the Persians and the Greeks have been so fraught, it was very easy for them to come out of nowhere. So that's where we are. Next slide. So let's get back to the Crusade. So we've had, going through a few hundred years, we've had this Islamic invasion. What's the experience of Catholics, Christians in the Mediterranean at this time? There's a whole variety of events that happen that are remembered and that are considered to be a big issue. And I've listed them. There. The conquest of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean, through Europe. The whole notion that Jerusalem is no longer part of Christianity from a geographic point of view. The conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which of course Spain and Portugal, and up to the Battle of Tours. So in 732 AD, that is as I said, the moment where the French, with some of the Spanish, defeat the Islamic push into Europe. There's epic poems written about this. It's a big moment, and it becomes quite a strong mythological moment, like the Anzacs for us in a way. But also it's important to notice that due to the nature of the Mediterranean being a sea, you can pop around it very easily. You don't have to always march around it. So the Saracens, which is a generic word for Islamic armies and Islamic soldiers, start attacking in Italy. They actually sack St. Peter's Basilica, which is outside the walls. At one stage, they conquer Sicily. So that's, you've got kind of the papal states, and the Italians are experiencing that. But down the bottom is the kind of the clinch of the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 AD, which is too far from the Crusade. So that's, I wonder if we go to the next slide, perhaps something like the next slide. There you can see it at the top right there. So the Battle of Manzikert happens when a whole huge number of tribes of the Turks convert to Islam. So before the Umayyads, they were more Arabian, the Turks convert to Islam, they start harassing much closer to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which is now Istanbul. And so you can probably guess who won in the end. The Emperor of Byzantium amasses an army. He really puts his life on the line, so to speak. Gets as many of his troops together as he can to confront the Turks. And they meet in the Battle of Manzikert, and the Byzantines are decimated. And it kind of the end of the ability for the Byzantines to defend that territory of Asia Minor. And then you can see, if you look at the dates, you can see after Manzikert, you have a whole variety of battles. You might know there's Constantinople just across the Bosphorus, they're protected, but you might know, for instance, the town of Nicaea, which had one of the councils of the early church. So that all becomes Islamic territory, and it's a big problem there. It's not as though they've had enough. They want Constantinople. They're harassing Constantinople. Next slide. Yes.
So they've occupied Anatolia.
Yes.
What are those islands that are still Constantinopolitan? Is that Cyprus on the right and Rhodes?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep, should be in Malta. Remember? And they're very important. I won't be going into that part of the Crusades, but those islands enable ships to protect parts of the Mediterranean. So Islamic, they were called pirates by some, but I mean they're armies. Islamic navies try and conquer these places. And like the history of Rhodes and Malta is very linked to the order of Hospitalis, the order of St. John, Jerusalem, Rhodes and Malta. And there's an amazing story of the defence of these places. I won't be going into that, but I recommend you read up yourselves on that. Next slide, please. So while that's all happening in the Middle East, in the Byzantine Empire, this is the former Western Roman Empire. That this is all the different kingdoms and principalities of Europe. And very important because these are the people who go on crusade. You've got the German Empire, sometimes known as the Holy Roman Empire, which shifts and changes. You've got the French Kingdom, if you can see that in the blue next to the German Empire. You've got England, Scotland, you've got a variety of Swedish countries, and you can see in Spain and Iberia, so Spain and Portugal, there's been a fight back. Considered the longest war in history, the Spanish Reconquista. St. Dominic has a lot of involvement in that, of course, being a Spaniard. When was Dominic around? He was a bit later than here. I mean, that whole Spanish
1170
Reconquista.
421.
Yeah.
So this is during his lifetime.
Yes.
Well, no, before his lifetime.
Yeah, just before. But he just as a side, he comes into his own during this whole Crusader movement as Robert.
I mean, in St. Dominic's time, part of most of Spain, or half of Spain, was Islamic.
Yes, yeah. And the fight would have been going on.
I believe the town St. Dominic came from was actually along the border.
Oh yeah, okay.
So so it was.
What was his town again?
Caruaga. So
Yes.
it was actually one of the border forts
Yes.
in the Islamic
Yeah.
world. Yeah.
The Reconquista is another very amazing story about the Crusades. It starts before the formal Crusades begin, and it's definitely worth looking into. The whole exchange of culture, because I'm talking about conflict here, but we also know that within conflict there's also peaceful exchange that happens between people at the same time. It's very interesting. There's an exchange of ideas, how Spanish culture is influenced by Islamic culture, and vice versa. So anyway, there we go. So you've got but what's also important is if we pop back and see the Byzantine Empire in the orange, you've got two distinct Islamic groups in this period. You've got the Seljuks, who are Turks, and you have the Fatimids, who are based around Egypt. And they're not happy with each other either. So that's very helpful.
Is it the Sunni Shia thing?
No, not that side.
Sunni.
Yeah.
All Sunni then. Here we're around.
Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go into where does the notion of a crusade come from in Christianity. So I've given you a bit of the geopolitics. And it's going to be very quick, and the theologians here do a much better job than me. But in that period, you've got the beginnings of how does Christianity defend itself in all this turmoil? What's a soldier? It's a knight. How are they moral? What do they do that's moral and still be a soldier? There's reference to the Gospels, and you find in the literature a reference to Christ never tells the soldiers to stop being soldiers. It's very kind of it's a bit of an esoteric exegesis, but to put it that way. You have Augustine, who is around during kind of the rise of the Visigoths, so he doesn't really see Muslims. He starts to go into conversations about violence and how it can be just. He talks about violence as an acceptable way to punish and to teach. He refers to smacking your children, and how that concept is acceptable. Aquinas isn't around yet. Now, Aquinas really fleshes out the notion of justice, but I won't be going to that because he's not around yet. The medieval view, of course, is what's the vibe? What's the vibe? What's Marbo for these people? And it's pretty simple. As we want to, we're allowed to defend ourselves, but I'm also allowed to chastise and take down tyrants and things like that. But the medieval view is also very important. The medieval lifestyle, it's a military, very much a military and an agrarian society, which is pretty much the history of humanity up until standing armies appeared around the Napoleonic era. So it's not particularly strange to anyone but us and modernity. And so that's why these ideas are being contended with, because Christianity has gone from being a kind of a small Jewish sect. It's grown and grown and grown. It's become acceptable in the empire. The empire's crumbled. People have to look after themselves, so to speak. So next slide, please. Now, when kind of trying to encapsulate the notion of what the First Crusade was and what crusading was, this is my own definition. And I'll let you read that for a second. I won't read it out. With the notion of holy war, we get to the point where war and fighting is perceived as not necessarily a bad thing, but actually a virtuous act. Now, not going bashing, having a rough up at the pub. That's not necessarily a virtuous act, unless I'm defending part of mine, it's not vagrant, but that's the concept. So that means entering into violence to defend, and by defend, not just people, but defending the church, defending particular holy objects, holy items, holy sites, is virtuous. And that's, you can understand, that's probably the fundamental concept of just war theory that we get from Thomas Aquinas and onwards. And I say, what I say, the perceived will of Christ, because of course this whole notion can be abused by people all throughout history. So there's not necessarily in every individual's case an infallible moment where they're always doing the right thing with these motives in mind. But this is the concept. Holy war, being a soldier, being a knight, chivalry comes out of this, all these concepts. Crusading is a particular lightning rod for these kind of discussions. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens in 1095? Urban II preaches at the Council of Clermont and in other places afterwards that he's calling upon the soldiers, the knights of Christian countries to go and liberate the church in the Holy Land, to go on armed pilgrimage. It's a new concept. Soldiers, an army going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land and to rescue it. But where did this come from? We've got the whole experience of what would be considered constant attack on Christians in Europe by Muslim armies. There's also a desire to unify with the Eastern Church. Not that far beforehand, after a very fractious relationship, we have the formal beginnings of the Eastern Orthodox as separate from Western Catholics. And it's a very big issue. We have the Battle of Manzikert happens, and that means that the Byzantine emperor is consistently sending a request for assistance to the nobility of the West, including the Pope. So have this kind of variety, this kind of connection of a whole variety of things. And the Crusades are considered to be a way to assist the suffering Christians in the Middle East. You've got the rise of pilgrimage to the holy places as well. So Europe kind of gets to a state where people feel like they are able to travel to Jerusalem, to go on pilgrimage. It's very, very strong. And that, of course, builds up a whole discussion about, well, why is this place no longer in the hands of Christians? It was. At the same time, they're often treated badly. Not always, but often treated badly. And you've got a flow of information coming back. The whole notion of relics. Now, we kind of consider relics to be this kind of weird, that okay, we'll Catholic tradition we have on the side. But that's not the fundamental view of relics. In most of Western Christianity. Relics are a very, very important part. Sacred objects, sacred bodies of saints, these are a serious consideration. It's argued, and I accept it, I think it's true, that in fact the veneration of relics is much older than the veneration of the Eucharist, for instance, and a lot of our Eucharistic piety actually originates in the piety shown to relics. Now, I'll let Father Marnez and a few others talk about the theology of relics, but what I'm trying to say here is that the whole notion that there is a whole area of relics that, including places where Christ walked, that have been venerated since the beginning, in Islamic hands. In some places are being desecrated, for instance, the Church of Holy Sepulchre. If anyone's been there, there's a little chapel over the side of the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre originally was a cave, and it was destroyed by one of the Muslim caliphs who chipped it away to nothing. So now you don't have the floor of it used to be a cave, for instance. These things are heard of. It's considered absolutely sacrilegious and an attack upon Christianity. We also have papal precedents here. So the Pope just doesn't wake up one morning and go, oh yeah, well let's just go and kill a few Muslims. So that's not what happened, to kind of be blunt. He was part of a reform movement within the church that focused upon a number of things, including the liberty of churches from the control of oppressive kings and princes and knights, etc., etc. He was part of the Cluniac movement, and that's a Benedictine movement that was very, very strong, was focused on independence. So these monasteries were not, based in Cluny in southern France, these monasteries were not attached to the local ruler, they were not attached to the local bishop, they were independent. These Cluniacs were also very involved in the Spanish reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. So there's a whole notion of liberty, of the liberty of the church, of the role of knights in protecting that liberty. And of course, you can see how that transfers over to the role of knights in Christendom, protecting the liberty of Christians, their brother Christians in the Middle East, and the liberty of churches and relics and sacred sites from Islamic control as well, and also Islamic attack. And we have, as part of that reform, you've got a whole notion of the three orders, and these reformers come up with the notion of you've got the serfs, the workers, the agrarian workers in society, you've got the church, one of the other orders, and then you've got the nobility and the knights and the soldiers, and that's their place. Their place is to protect and look after those other two orders. So that's very, very much part of the reform movement. And the Council of Clermont, where the Crusade was preached, was focused mainly on all these kind of issues. You can look at all the canons of the councils and things like that. They very rarely refer to the Crusade. There's actually only one. Next slide, please. So, when we're talking about the Crusade, what was it? We have one piece of legislative documentation that describes what the idea of the Crusade was. It comes from the Council of Clermont, and that's it up there. Whoever for devotion alone, not to obtain honour or money, shall set out to free the Church of God at Jerusalem, that shall be counted to him for all penance. That's it. That's the fundamental. So we see the whole concept of it being a religious movement. It's not, in fact, it's decidedly against the notion it's going to gain money or land or power. It's a penitential movement. It's considered an act of charity, an act of prayer. That's the fundamental call of the Pope. Now, maybe not all Crusaders followed it, but that's the original concept of crusading. It is, in fact, the first ever recorded plenary indulgence that I understand that to be the case. I haven't found any earlier ones. There could have been some references to it earlier in the beginnings of the Spanish reconquest, but that's just an interesting theological aside. It's the beginning of plenary indulgences. Many things like those. Church leaders. So again, I've talked about the concept. I think we can ask questions about it a bit more at the end if you like, but I'll get into the history of the First Crusade. See, these are some of the characters. You've got Urban II, Pope. He doesn't go in crusade, but he calls it. He appoints Adhemar of Le Puy as his legate on the crusade, the figurehead and leader of the crusade. He seems to be the convener of the meeting of generals, all the different knights and nobles who go. He dies at some stage and things get a little bit shaky after that, unfortunately. You've got Alexius Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, one of the emperors who had asked for assistance from the west. He sends a general, Tacticos, to go with the Crusader army, and there's the Turks and the Fatimids, the two different Islamic groups that we have referred to earlier. Next slide, please. There's a large number of high-ranking nobility that go on crusade. Raymond of Toulouse is probably the most powerful. He is southern Toulouse, of course, south of France, and he actually was already giving his services in fighting against the Moors, who are the name of the Spanish Muslims who invaded Spain. So he had a lot of experience. He suggested that he already knew the Pope was going to call a crusade because he was there straight away to agree to it. So there's ideas that this is not just spontaneous, it was a long-standing plan to do so. Bohemond of Taranto and Tancred, well, they're both Vikings, really, they're Normans. They're a little bit more of what you would call the opportunistic crusaders, if we were going to cast judgment upon them. Bohemond was at war with Alexius Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, for a while. But even that is, I'll talk about that later if I don't remind me, even this concept of them being just out and about to get their hands on some land and money and power is not, there are considerable mitigating factors with regard to that. Robert of Normandy, who of course is also a Norman, and he's, I can't remember, I'm sorry, he's related to William the Conqueror, of course, which is his brother. Anyway, they're very close. It wasn't long since the Norman conquest of England when the Crusade occurred. Stephen of Blois is very important. We'll come to him later. Next slide. Uni students get a little bit more excited about this, but I mean, there's just an example of sort of the military history we've got going on here. So on the right, we have a Byzantine soldier, they have scale armour as well. On the left is a fully equipped Western knight, a Frankish knight. The Turks used to just refer to them as the Franks, so I'm not sure why, but the whole group of them were the Franks. You see how they're very heavy, there's a lot of heavy armour. In the middle is Hospitale. He's been fighting the Middle East for a while, so you can see he's kind of gotten used to the temperature. He's getting a bit excited there.
Are these all 11th century?
Yeah, they're all 11th century. The middle fellow is so the Hospitaller, he's early 12th century. But I mean, it's very similar.
Because the kite shields, I didn't think got as early as the 11th.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. The long kite shield, they get shorter and shorter as they start fighting on horseback more and more. It's the long kite shield. And you would have round shields too.
Yeah.
Were they still using sort of Roman tactics at that time, like turtle formation?
No.
They'd
They'd be something very different. I'll tell you about it now.
Oh, the Turks smashed that age.
So this reminds me of Father Marno's going to the pub. He started little. See what it looks like when he leaves. Now, speaking of tactics, and this is Father Marno's on the right.
This is a Francis.
Wrong habit.
Him leading the students to virtue. But so the big tactic, military tactic that is fairly new is the cavalry charge. It's absolutely unstoppable. It's considered to be completely unstoppable. These heavy knights riding what we consider Clydesdales, into battle. The daughter of the Byzantine emperor said, you know, these knights could charge their way to Babylon. And when you're stuck in front of these guys, you're in trouble. Now, there's also a lot of dismounted fighting and things like that, but that is the core of the Western Army, and it is amazing. I would recommend you read the Islamic account of the Battle of Hattin, where the Crusaders were defeated, and how a group of 20 or 30 knights absolutely terrified Saladin to the point where even though he was 20 to 1, he still was worried he was going to lose because they were kept charging. It's an amazing story just to account for the power of the cavalry charge. So no, they're not Roman formations, they're cavalry, heavy cavalry. Now the Byzantines, they were a little bit more light horse-like, they had a lot more infantry, but they in the end don't get that involved here. Next slide, please. Some Byzantine, some Islamic soldiers. Actually, no, they're Islamic, and some Byzantine mercenaries, but you can see that they're much more lightly armed. They often have horse archers. We'll get to the next slide. You go to the next slide as well. They move around a lot more quickly. It's a very different way of fighting. Next slide, please.
I was reading Russian, sorry.
That's okay. And here's an example of them in battle. You can see that he's lost his horse, and this becomes very dangerous for the Crusaders when they're stuck in this situation in the desert. They need their horses, and they're being carried by fast-moving.
That starts fighting when it comes through from the Genghis Khan.
Yes, yeah, that's the idea. It's a very Turkish way of fighting. Next slide, please. Probably skip through these bits. Now, these are the Fraternities, the Egyptians. They're a little bit more heavy in their armour and their fighting. They're still not the heavy, really well-armed knights, but they're not as heavy horse archers. They use camel and a whole variety of things. Okay.
The bloke on the left is interesting.
Which one?
On the left with the white turban, because he looks like a Jew, but his shield has writing that looks, it's not quite hieroglyphic, it's almost proto-Glagolithic.
It's Arabic.
Yeah, it's
Can't read it very well enough to do the script.
But all these are arts and dresses, of course, from historical.
Oh, so it's probably Jibber Jabber.
Who knows? Anyway, speaking of Jibber Jabber, how about you pipe down back and we'll take the next slide. These guys are my former students. Okay. First Crusade. So I'll move fairly quickly, but 1095 it's called. They start moving from various parts of Europe in 1096, and they all, if you notice, they all meet in Constantinople. Also notice there's no ships that decide to go overland. There's a huge, from memory I can't remember how many, but there's several tens of thousands of troops, and of course they're all going across Europe to get to Constantinople, to meet in Constantinople. Now, the emperor isn't particularly excited to have huge armies encamped around Constantinople. I mean, yeah, they're all Christians, but armies are a difficult thing to feed, they get very restless, and he wants to move them across very quickly. But what's very important is that the leaders of the Crusade, including Adamant the Weak, have a conference with the Byzantine emperor. And what we now know is that the plan was, this is fairly recent scholarship in the last 5 to 7 years. We're now sure that the leaders of many of the leaders of the Crusader army agreed to be vassals of the Byzantine emperor. So the concept was, it's not just let's go in and knock about in the Middle East and see what we can do. There was a planned desire to reconquer and retake the Byzantine lands, so that the Western leaders would become senior figures in various areas in the Byzantine Empire, and at the same time the Church of the East would be reconfirmed, and that happens for a fair while. And so people like Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, the Viking, the Norman, these guys, it was considered a long time they were just going there to gain money and power and booty, and then they went off and took these lands, but in fact we see that there was a very, very clear legal plan to make all these conquests work properly. Now that doesn't happen, but that's the plan. So they, next slide, sorry. So they cross to Nicaea and they have their first few battles. They conquer Nicaea. They lay siege to it, but Nicaea surrenders to the Byzantines. I think that's a very important point. Some of the Crusaders would have liked to have gone in and got a bit more money and supplies for their next campaign, but they surrendered to the Byzantines. The argument is being that was actually intentional and that this was meant to be a joint effort from the East and Western Christians. They then moved to the Battle of Dorylaeum, and Dorylaeum is very interesting. It's military tactics. So the Crusaders split into two columns. Admiral Lepuy, the bishop, leading one, and Bohemond of Taranto and his group leading another. They're in the desert. Bohemond's group gets attacked by horse archers. They can't repel them. They're very, very thirsty and tired. And to stop the horse archers, they pitch all these tents along their flank. So it's kind of a barrier for these light horse soldiers. And Admiral Lepuy meets up with them and they defeat the Turks at the Battle of Dorylaeum. Next slide, please. Now, Antioch is one of the big moments of the Crusade. So Antioch is an enormous city. It's on a river, and they lay siege to Antioch, the Crusaders. The various warring Turkish Islamic groups eventually realised that this is a bit of a problem, what's going on here. And they attack the besieging army. They are repelled, and historians are still unsure how they repel this army. The Crusaders think it's divine intervention. They carry relics around on processions, they pray before these battles. It's possible. They defeat the Turks. They managed to conquer Antioch via a Maronite who shows them how to get in. They're here for years, and they eventually conquer Antioch, but then they're besieged in Antioch by another army that comes along. And once again, they've run out of horses. They've got hardly any horses left. Apparently the Maronites are trying to sell a horse for one horse for the price of 10 years' wages or something like that to them. They're also besieged within Antioch, from the citadel of Antioch. They hadn't conquered, so there's a whole Turkish garrison that's attacking them as well. Bohemond of Taranto is the fellow who by the way, who gets them into Antioch. But one of the big things that happens in Antioch affects the rest of the history of the Mediterranean. They're besieged in Antioch. They think it's their end. It's all over. Stephen of Blois, one of the leaders of the Crusade, climbs the wall and runs away to go home. Tacticos, the Byzantine general who's with them, does the same. Stephen of Blois meets the Emperor Alexios Komnenos with an enormous army marching to meet the Crusaders. He says to them, it's all over, it's all lost, go home. It's an absolute disaster, we're all going to die. The Emperor, knowing that he doesn't have much more steam if he gets defeated, and not wanting to expose Constantinople by having his army out in Antioch, turns around and goes home. And Admiral Lepuy dies, the papal legate. So we get a real shake-up of what the original plan was. And from then, the whole connection with the Byzantine emperor and the empire falls apart. We don't see that whole political and church unification connection continue. Stephen LeBlanc eventually goes home. He arrives home, not long later the message comes back, the Crusaders have conquered Jerusalem. He lives in shame. His wife is very upset with him, sends him back, and he dies not long away. So. Don't annoy your wife.
Daniel, do you think the battle would have been won if that army had gone in?
Well, if that army had gone in, then it would have been. The argument could be made that the whole of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern history would be completely different. It's very unlikely that the Crusaders would have been, years later ejected from the Crusader states of Palestine. It would have been very different to the history of the Ottoman Empire, like we're going hundreds of years forward. It's likely there would have been a much stronger unification between the Eastern churches and the Western churches. The original plan was foiled, as often happens, by the vicissitudes of these things. And the Crusaders begin to feel abandoned by the Byzantines. Up until this point, they're reappointing all of the Byzantines, well, not reappointing, but they themselves are confirming their allegiance to the local Greek bishop of the area, etc., etc. But that starts to fizzle out when both the papal legate Adhemar dies, so he doesn't have that. They don't have that kind of sense of what the Pope's original intention was along the way, and that authority, and also the Byzantines don't come. So that's what happens. Now I'll talk about now the siege of Jerusalem, but a quick connection between Antioch and Jerusalem. So even though they're surrounded by this huge army, and I think they're going to die besieged in Antioch, they eventually gather themselves together and lead a charge out of the city of Antioch and defeat the Turks. And the Turks essentially give up. So when the Crusaders go south to Jerusalem, the garrisons just let them into the cities, like Tripoli and Joppa and all those places. There's no large amount of fighting. The Turks go, okay, can't defeat these guys. But they get to Jerusalem, it's run by Fraternities. So that's a different area. So we get to the siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a big city. If I had internet connection, we could watch a trebuchet in action, but I'm sure you can imagine it. And it's a big moment because these guys had planned to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And in fact, in Antioch, they were resting in Jerusalem. The heads of the crusade were resting in Jerusalem for a year at least. But eventually the soldiers, their underlings, started to pull down the walls of Antioch, saying, no, we want to go to Jerusalem, hurry up, let's go. So off they go. They get to Jerusalem, and they perform processions around Jerusalem. Very similar to the old rite of the consecration of the church, with 3 days of processions and fasting and preaching, and they're all very, very religiously motivated to take the city.
Jericho.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And from memory, there is written evidence that there was a connection as well. So it's not just our speculation, but that kind of thing. And at the same time, some Italian crusaders had arrived on the coast. They brought up lots of timber, and they created trebuchets and siege towers. And that's how they eventually conquer Jerusalem. They, I think it's 2 days fighting. Next slide, you can see some siege towers. You guys might have seen those before in history studies, but of course they go up against the wall, and soldiers climb up and fight on the battle. So originally ancient Roman design. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The trebuchet is very, very powerful. It's a huge counterweight. But in the First Crusade, they think they didn't have a counterweight. They just had about 300 guys pulling it around. very effective, but I'm not sure how true. I'm pretty sure that's the way the First Crusade catapults work. So they conquer Jerusalem. To put it lightly, things get out of hand. Jerusalem is sacked, and there's a lot of talk of the massacre that happens. Now, I discussed that. We maybe can talk about that in questions, but the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, very bloody. They crowned Godfrey. Godfrey de Bouillon is not crowned. He refuses to be crowned in the city where Christ was crowned with thorns, but he takes over the title of protector of the Holy Sepulchre and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which becomes the King of Jerusalem. After that, before this happens, they are still, so they've defeated the Fraternities, but the Fraternities, they're based in Egypt. An enormous army comes from Egypt, and they meet in Ascalon a couple of days after Jerusalem, and their cavalry charge defeats the Fraternities in Ascalon. They have the First Crusade, and there's the establishment of the Crusader states, which don't last too long, but that, and you can see, some of them only last till 1289. The fall of Acre is a really strategic fall, and from this you have a constant stream of crusading that happens ever since. Crusading almost becomes institutionalised, like for us hospitals. So hospitals originally were a great act of personal charity, but they still are, but they become quite institutionalised. It's one of the things that we do is look after people in hospitals. In the Middle Ages, one of the things you did was go on crusades to defend Christianity and Christians from attack. I'll leave it there on the history of the crusade, and I might open up for questions, but what I've tried to do is discuss just the history of the First Crusade and weave into it some of the themes, the theological themes. You've probably picked up, and Robert referred to it, the whole notion of the big myth. Were the Crusades unprovoked wars of aggression from Christians? There's no question they were aggressive, that's what war tends to be. But it's very clear that the crusading movement in its entirety, when we're talking to Christian Islamic crusades, were defensive. Always have been, always were, and there's very, very few examples of them not being. What the personal disposition of each soldier is, of course, very interesting. There's a lot of work done on that. There's a lot of study done on why individual soldiers went on the First Crusade. Jonathan Riley Smith wrote the seminal work on that topic because, of course, to find out, you look at, well, they had to put all their affairs in order before they left. What did they say? And there was always religious motivation. The cost of going on the crusade was far more than what they would have gained. And there's an argument, they thought they would have gained more, but they didn't end up knowing. In the writings, you find that they know very well that they're going to be losing out personally to go on these armed pilgrimages. So that's what they wrote. So when we're thinking about the Crusades, I think my final point before questions would be, it's a very important, as I said, a very important period of history for Catholics to understand. It's important to know the vicissitudes, ins and outs of the crusading movement. This is the first one, the snapshot, the beginning of it. But fundamentally, the Crusaders believed, and the popes believed, and the Byzantines believed that the Crusades were an act of love for one's neighbour and defence of oneself and one's neighbour. So there we go. Any questions?
What was Jerusalem like? I mean, was Jerusalem before the takeover of the Muslim, I suppose the Muslims, was it a Christian town?
Yes, oh yeah, it's
So
yeah.
Thoroughly Christian, and then
very much.
Muslims just invaded.
Yeah, so it had.
And I suppose there were still Jews there.
Yeah, there were, but it's after the diaspora. So No, St. Helena's and Constantine's works there were well underway. Well, they'd been completed. It was a fully fledged Byzantine city.
So in essence, you know, it's kind of like we're taking it back from,
Yeah.
it was a Christian place,
Yeah.
we're just...
And you
kind of
see that,
restoring Christianity.
and it's not just a concept, you see that in the writings of the First Crusaders, of the papal writings, of the whole notion that this is a reconquest,
Yeah.
a reclamation, that's the word they use.
But it's kind of like, you know...
It's not a conquest.
You know, the Christians in the West sort of see that their Eastern brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, you know, enslaved,
Yep.
whatever, by Muslims, and sort of says, well, let's liberate them in a sense.
That's right. That's the fundamental
Yeah.
kind of concept of it. It's that, and the writings have consistent discussion of that, and it's from a variety of levels. You have the Byzantine emperor asking formal military assistance. You have some monasteries, some Western monasteries still in the Middle East, sending back messages. There's a Cluniac monastery that ends up
In Jerusalem.
a very
Oh, right.
small one. So
Wow.
there's, you've got free flow of information. You've got pilgrims coming back, so that's the specific focus of Jerusalem, plus the whole notion of relics and the religious experience and the nature of the Catholic religious.
So the life under Islam in those territories in Jerusalem, Christians could still practice, but I suppose
Yeah.
on the very top they have to pay that tax.
Yeah, and it goes up and down. There's really aggressive attitudes, and like for instance, the Church Holy Sepulchre gets chipped away. There's intrigue. There's a whole variety. There's very heavily oppressive taxes. There's attack by Islamic pirates, and the general consistent feeling that Christianity is under attack by Islamic forces around the Mediterranean. And, well, what's the solution? It's not anything but.
So just sort of like over the gate, welcome them in, you know, just have a little chat.
And look, you can't call the United you can't call the United Nations and complain back then.
Exactly.
Not that that does anything much. I had someone saying, well, why are people so violent back then? I said, what are they going to do? Call the police? There's no police. So we have such a, Westerners have such a sanitised and well organised life. We have a standing army, we have police, we have courts we can trust, all these things, generally speaking, we can trust them. And, you call up someone on the phone and the police should turn up to your door. That's just back then. And that's why I went through, hopefully, a bit of the context of this. And the other context, of course, is that up until very recently, there's no separation between church and state, so what we describe it. There's no concept of kind of secular society. Your religion is your religion. Everybody has a similar religion, so to speak, and everything we do is a religious act of some kind. Now we know that as Christians, we believe that. Imagine if that's the concept of society, which is in fact the concept of societies pretty much throughout history until post-Enlightenment Western mindset.
I only just recently read Rodney Stark's account of...
Oh, I've never read it. Yeah.
Because he seems to have a very scathing view of the Byzantines. So he really paints them as kind of the duplicitous bunch who's playing both sides to advantage and so forth. What do you think of that?
I think that's pretty accurate.
Yes, right.
The individuals during the First Crusade don't seem to be as much that way, but the history of Byzantium is them constantly being hampered by their own intrigue. Yeah. And even the horrible experience of the Fourth Crusade, where the Crusaders in the end turned on the Byzantines and conquered Constantinople. The Byzantines themselves, there was heaps of Byzantines involved on both sides, so it's all very complicated. And one of the arguments is that what were the Byzantines doing, ignoring these tribes down in Arabia? Why hadn't they been evangelise. So they go, well, because they didn't care, they were too busy. Yeah.
One of the reasons I heard why the Muslims were so easily able to overcome the Byzantine Empire was because the extremely high taxes that the Byzantine charged.
Yes.
And under Islam, you pay the jizya and much smaller taxes, and they were much fairer.
Yeah. The Umayyads are considered after the first period of expansion to be like fairly, they're not kind of the rabid, wild, slaughtering. Islam has never been spread by hugs, it's only been spread by war, pretty much. But at the same time, the Umayyads are considered to be far more civilized. They used to have debates in Spain about theological debates and things like that. But it never lasts. There's always a rise of aggression.
Christians and Jews are always second-class citizens.
Yes, that's right.
Never treated well.
Yeah. So they're always at the mercy of.
The Jews under the Christian empire could be treated very badly or very well.
Yeah, that's right. But of course, there are all those examples of Christian-Islamic interaction and things like that that are positive, but overall, and look, we still see it today. It's still difficult. It's very different now. For the Ottoman Empire, as well as a whole variety of political and religious shake-ups in the Middle East, but it's still going on in some form or other.
Any other questions? Well,
I'm going to teach you for a bit.
and over here. Now that Dan's completed his presentation, I think it becomes a bit clearer why this is the start of our convention. We have experienced something very similar to the rise of Islam in our own lifetime. In just the last 200 years, we've gone from the concept of a fractured but still recognizable Christendom, even though for nearly 1,000 years Christendom had been split down the middle between the West and the Wrong, as we viewed it then. Now we have almost a zombie left in its place. We have Western society and Eastern Christian, formerly Christian society, sort of as an animated corpse, wandering around looking for its soul and trying to instead devour whatever it finds. And we've seen this tremendously rapid development of a completely pathological culture, one that is still more or less governed by Western principles like the rule of law and justice and things like, as Dan said, courts that we used to believe we could trust and now we don't. The idea that there is a force, a standing army, which is paid out of our taxes to protect our borders, but doesn't anymore. And a police force to enforce the rule of law and to prosecute justice against criminals and to protect the innocent who maintain just a very comfortable way of life. All of that is crumbling around us and has only really done so within a lifetime at its most rapid. We're really facing almost a crusader moment ourselves, but we didn't win the Crusades. Constantinople is now Istanbul and has been for 5 centuries. And so we need to learn from the failure of our forefathers. That's why we as lay Dominicans are better placed than the Crusaders were, because ultimately it's truth and the study of the truth, the contemplation of that truth, the preaching of that truth, which has any hope of winning the new war. This is no longer a physical war, it's no longer a geographic war. They've won the geographic war. We live as exiles within our own homelands. Our only hope now is in preaching. And so I'd like to thank you, Dan, for giving this to us. Here's a card with your name on it, and here's a bottle that I think you will